So hopefully you can all see my screen, and hopefully you can all hear me as well. I've gone to that little sidebar in Zoom where I'm into the ether now, and I hope that you all can. If you can't hear me or there's any technical problems, please do flag them off. Just flick your camera off and on, or shout to me on unmute. That's absolutely fine, and I will do my best to fix those. Thank you very much for joining me. Like I've just said, there's going to be quite a lot of people watching the recording afterwards. We'll go through a little bit of housekeeping, and then I will kick off with what the Wildlife Watcher Consumer Survey was, what the results showed, and the implications for your businesses if you work for an optical company. And if you're watching this from the perspective of a generally interested party, hopefully there's some data in there that you think is quite interesting and that maybe you can use going forward. So what was the Wildlife Watcher Consumer Survey? It ran for a month from the 22nd of February to the 22nd of March, and it was run in association with Cruelty Free Optics, which is a project that I freelance for. And we were trying to understand what sorts of people identified as wildlife watchers. There's a whole spectrum of people in there. We were looking at how they perceived themselves. Were they experts? Did they think that they were naturalists? Did they think that they were birders, botanists, enthusiasts? Did they see themselves as being very casual? What sorts of optics were they using? What exactly? So binoculars, telescopes, binoculars, cameras, that kind of thing. Why were they using them? What was the purpose of their wildlife watching? What enjoyment did they get out of it, or was it kind of a job or scientific? And how were they using those? We asked questions that related to wildlife and nature issues and environmental issues, so the kind of campaigns that people got involved with, the kind of things that people really cared about. And also there was a general question for us as the researchers of this, is there a scope to open up discussions within the wildlife watching community about the concept of ethical optics? Is this something they're receptive to? Is this something they know about already? And what are the touch points and opportunities for us running a project? So a quick bit about me. My name is Lucy McRobert, and I'm a freelance wildlife storyteller and marketing consultant. I used to work for the NGO sector in the wildlife world in the UK up until about 3 years ago, when I went freelance after having my little girl. As part of my portfolio, which includes lots of different projects to do with editorial, a bit of research, some communications work, copywriting, that sort of thing, I also work for Mark Constantine, who is the CEO and founder of Lush Cosmetics, as I'm sure you know. Ethical or cruelty-free optics first came about in 2016 with the publication of the first ethical consumer report entitled Shooting Wildlife: Who Makes Our Binoculars, Spotting Scopes and Optics? And the purpose of that initial report was to shine a light on the optics companies around the world, the top 30, the biggest 30 that there were, and how different arms of their businesses interacted with different wildlife sectors. So for example, the hunting sector and the shooting sector, the wildlife watching sector, and the more specific birder, botanist specific natural history sector. It was funded initially, Mark Constantine commissioned the first report. Since then, Ethical Optics has developed as part of the Ethical Consumer brand. I do not work for Ethical Consumer, I should say that up front. So if you have any specific questions about the Ethical Consumer reports, I can direct those onto the relevant writers who took part in those reports and did the research, but I did not do that piece of research, and I can't answer specific questions on that, although I'm very happy to help you get the answers that you may want and need. So how will we use our research? Essentially, what were we looking for? I believe when you're running any project or campaign, call it what you like, that you need to really understand your audience, understand where they are, their motivations, and in this case, their consumer habits. So this was a real starting point for me in recognizing that the wildlife watching community is very diverse, from their backgrounds through to the way that they experience wildlife and the way that they interact with the natural world. So this was a real exercise in understanding that audience. What do they care about? What is driving them in their motivations? How much of a lifestyle choice is this? We're going to use that research to help direct our project so that we can identify some core audiences and some core touch points. However, we want to share our findings with the wildlife watching industry because we believe that transparency is really important. A whole part of the campaign of Ethical Optics is transparency. So in order to be leaders in that field, we want to be transparent with you as well. We'll use our findings to inform the next steps of our projects. But we want to keep discussions about ethical optics and consumer knowledge and choice really transparent. We want to include the relevant stakeholders, which is you guys, and we want to make that data available to as many people as possible. So there's nothing going on behind kind of closed doors. There's nothing dodgy going on. We really just want to be part of this discussion and keep this discussion moving forward for people who may be really motivated by the idea of ethical optics. We looked at a variety of brands. These brands were based on the Ethical Consumer Report. However, we did have a focus on the ones that are more prevalent in the UK. So Canon, Hawke, Kowa, Leica, Nikon, Olympus, Optocron, Panasonic, Sony, Swarovski, Viking, which is the RSPB brand, Zeiss, and then other was our category. And then we got a number of responses through in the other section, including Celestron, Vortex, Bushnell, Pentax, Kite, Bar and Stroud, and so on. A couple of other brands that I'd never even heard of. I think they were like little teeny tiny Amazon brands, etc. So these were not specifically called upon. We didn't ask any real in-depth questions about your specific brands, but all of these brands were mentioned and people had the opportunity to comment on them or reflect on them. So we were asking things like, where do you watch wildlife and who with, just to really understand these people and how they're going out and enjoying nature. How would you describe yourself? Like I've said, are these casual naturalists through to specialists, birders, botanists, or expert all-round naturalists? When did you get your first optics and who from? Some really interesting gender data going to come on that later on. What brands do you own now and what brands did you own previously in your life? Again, some great gender stuff there and some good age things as well. How did you choose your optics? What do you look for and how often do you upgrade? Then we also asked things about nature reading. Do people read magazines? Do they read books? Do they read newspapers? Are they reading things online and interacting with the wildlife community on Twitter, Facebook, and on websites? And what else are they watching on television, if at all? Are they watching Springwatch? Are they watching Countryfile? Are they watching the Big Blue Chip series? Or do they prefer nature documentaries or local television? We talked about taking action for wildlife as well. So what kind of things were people doing in their own lives, whether that's individual action through to taking part in big campaigns, and what issues did they really care about? What were those motivators for them that really got them riled up and motivated them to take action for nature? We also asked about memberships and their support of organisations, both national and local. So the demographics, we got an amazing 1,366 responses, which was absolutely incredible. It went viral on the first day. My inbox never stopped pinging. It was a really, really great time, actually. And as a consequence, we got a reasonably good demographic spread. 92% were from the UK, which is good because that was the target audience that we were talking about. Gender balance could have been better. We had 28% identifying as female, 72% identifying as male. With no other genders specified within that. We had 98% white and only 2% from ethnic backgrounds, which if I were to repeat the research would be a major area that I would want to focus on in the future, making sure that we are far more diverse, both in terms of race and culture as well as in gender. But we got a really good mix of ages, which was fantastic. So you can see there that we were spread really well actually across our different age categories. So 12% under 30, 20% 31 to 45, 39% 46 to 60, 27% 61 to 75, and just 2% over 76. Given this was an online survey, I'm not surprised about that limitations of that upper age level. It was distributed largely on social media, where older people might not be as prevalent, especially on Twitter. And also that idea of form filling in, I think a lot of older people have really had enough of online forms in a time of COVID. So as I've already alluded to, there were some limitations to our research, of course, with any marketing project there are, and I should be really clear to say this is not an academic study. We did have a couple of academics get in contact and say, oh, this isn't academic. No, it's not meant to be. This is a marketing study that takes a snapshot in time. We could repeat this research next year and get very similar results or completely different results. But if we were to repeat it again, we would look at the distribution. So partnering up with different groups would be one thing to make sure we reach different demographics. Taking part in newsletters, etc., would be really good rather than just relying on social media. We would look more at some of the nuance of some of the issues. There are some things that were simplified intentionally to get a very immediate reaction, a very emotional response, For example, with the causes that we asked people about, we asked about trophy hunting. And obviously, I know and you know that these are very complex issues, but we purposely didn't go into that nuance in this survey. There's an opportunity to do that in the future and establish the how different audiences react to those nuanced arguments rather than the simple black and white issues. And there are also additional questions that I'd love to ask now we know more. Whenever you're analysing data, the first thing you think is, oh, well, what if we'd asked this? Or maybe we should have this follow-on question next time. If we do repeat the research in the future, that's definitely something we'll look at. So on to our findings. So first of all, I'm going to go through the headlines across the entire sample, and then I'm going to break it down into gender, age groups, and then also those people who identified as specialists or experts. So overall, when purchasing optics, if your main driving factor is cost, you are most likely to choose Opticron, followed by Viking, which many people identified as the RSPB brand. They didn't realise that RSPB and Viking were separate entities, but the same in terms of some of their optics, or Nikon. If you were looking most of all for the quality of the lens and the optics, then overwhelmingly you were most likely to choose Swarovski with 42%. And if you were most driven by that brand association, so that logo and your association with the company, you're most likely to choose Swarovski again. Swarovski was definitely the brand perceived as being most associated with experts. And if your purchasing choices are influenced by your friends and word of mouth, then once again, that comes out on top, followed by Opticron. If you mainly read reviews to decide on what to buy, Swarovski again, very popular, followed by Opticron, Viking, Nikon, and Leica. And if going to optics demonstrations was the way that you chose your brand, which was a very popular way actually of choosing your optics, so that's nature reserve demonstrations, bird fair, that sort of thing. Again, Swarovski and Opticron performing well, and Viking taking nearly a third of the votes as well. So when purchasing optics again, just 64 people were consciously influenced by advertising, and of those, Opticron was the most popular brand. I think this reflects a really interesting shift away from that print advertising that we're seeing now, with more people putting more money behind digital comms and more money into their website journey, trying to encourage people to buy direct from the supplier rather than putting those big adverts in the magazines. And that's an interesting thing to think about from your brand perspective. 13% identified the ethics of the company as important in choosing their optics overall, but this is much lower than the 43% who said that they shopped ethically or tried to shop ethically in their own lives. That could be through buying ethical meat or going vegan. That could be looking at their energy provider, looking at where they buy their clothes, their toiletries, their cosmetics, that sort of thing. Again, we purposely kept that very broad in terms of the word ethics and the definition of ethics. It was up to personal interpretation how you chose to take that forward. 35% of these chose Viking. So the people who identified ethics as important, 35% of those chose Viking and 30% chose Opticron. So from that, what I take away is that the RSPB logo has an association with being ethical. Your headline stats. So you can see here, I won't go through all of these, otherwise you're just going to get bombarded with data. But we had a reasonably good spread across how people identified themselves through casual naturalists, enthusiastic naturalists, specialists, experts, and outdoorsy. So outdoorsy was at one end of the spectrum and experts at the other. We put birders, botanists, or other specialists under that specialist category, and that was by far the biggest. Nearly 50% of people watch wildlife in their garden, which was not unexpected, especially given what we've all been through in the past 18 months. I'd love to know if that's changed over the past 18 months, and maybe doing the research again in a year's time would show something different. 54% on a local patch and 36% on a local nature reserve. Again, reflecting the time of COVID, I haven't even included it here, but the amount of people saying they watch wildlife abroad was very, very small. That international market was tiny, and shockingly so. And again, I think that was more to do with the way that people were reacting to the questions very immediately rather than looking at a longer term trend. 66% of people watch wildlife on their own, 29% with a partner, 8% with their family, which is me taking my little girl out, and 16% going out watching wildlife with friends. So this perception we have of birders and botanists all being loners has some truth to it, but actually we're more sociable than we give each other credit for. When we're looking specifically at sport optics, in this we included binoculars, telescopes and monoculars, but monoculars were incredibly small in the marketplace, as I'm sure you would expect. So what we're really talking about here is binoculars and telescopes. 98% of people who responded owned either binoculars or telescopes, and of these 99% own binoculars. So that is really the big market where we're focusing our research. Swarovski was the most popular brand, followed by Opticon, Viking, Nikon, Leica and Zeiss. When we look at how often they're upgrading their optics, 60% rarely upgraded their optics, 29% upgraded every 6 to 10 years, and 11% upgraded every 2 to 5 years. I would like to know what they do for jobs and where they get their money from, because I can't afford that. Sport optics again. So what are they looking for? Well, the respondents were mostly looking for quality of the lens and the optics, which accounted for 86% of their buying motivations. Cost was an important factor for 50% of people. The brand was important for 40%, followed by weight and usability. 13% looked at the ethics of the company, as I've already said, and respondents were mostly informed by reviews, the reputation of the brand, the word of mouth, that chatting at Twitches and at when we're all out birding with our friends, what are people saying about those optics, and demonstrations, again, showing their importance. And I'm sure the companies here have probably felt some of the strain of not being able to do those optics demos over the past 18 months. All I can say is I really hope your online traffic has taken off with so many more people saying that they're interested in wildlife. I really hope that COVID hasn't impacted on your businesses too much. 48% were gifted their optics as a young person. 11% were gifted them as an adult, and 28% bought them themselves after research. So that gift in childhood or teenage years was really, really important no matter what age group you were in. When we look at wildlife photography, 60% of people owned a camera for wildlife photography, and 64% of these owned a DSLR. I think this reflects, certainly in the birding world, a general want for things to be accurate. I know as a birder, I'm constantly paranoid that I don't own a camera, and on the off chance that I stumbled across something rare, and on the off chance I managed to identify it, I know that in reality that photo is everything. It goes beyond just taking pictures for enjoyment, but there's a real personal motivation there of wanting your records to be accepted as well, and those DSLRs are way out in front in the natural history world. Canon and Nikon both popular, but Canon taking over 50% of the market that we looked at, and with 31% upgrading their kit regularly, so every 2 to 5 years, 33% upgrading every 6 to 10 years, and 36% rarely upgrading their kit. So this is a far more agile market than, say, binoculars and telescopes. People are looking more at what cameras are doing, the new functions that are coming on board, and are happy to put their money where their mouth is in quest of that better kit. Respondents mostly looked for quality of the lens and the optics, the cost, the usability and the weight. Obviously, using a camera is significantly more difficult to do than using a pair of binoculars for most people. So that usability was more important when it came into camera markets. Respondents were mostly informed by reviews, word of mouth and the brand as well. When we look at this group as a whole, we saw that 73% of people read online blogs and websites, and 63% of people were reading nature writing books. BBC Springwatch and nature documentaries were the most popular viewing, followed by blue chip series, compared to just 35% watching BBC Countryfile and 10% not watching any sort of wildlife television. Twitter was by far the most popular online channel for sharing their experiences, followed by Facebook and Instagram. 14% didn't use the internet at all, and 63% were members of the RSPB, and just over half were members of their local wildlife trust. Respondents overall were incredibly enthusiastic about helping wildlife. So 98% of people that responded did at least 2 things. The top environmentally aware practices included low plastic use at 85% and wildlife gardening at 75%, which is to be expected really when we see how much people are watching wildlife in their own gardens. Other popular practices included low meat diets. We didn't say vegan because we didn't want this to be prohibitive, but low meat or plant-based diets were very popular. Low carbon lifestyles are now becoming far more prevalent, and if you are part of the birding scene, On Twitter, you'll see a big drive towards people taking part in low carbon birding. There's a lot of social pressure to do that now. Volunteering was very popular, with 44% of people doing that, and ethical shopping at 43%. 26% of people partook in campaigning, and again, this was an intentionally vague word. Campaigning for some people could mean signing a petition, whereas for others it could mean literally taking plaques out to the centre of London and lobbying Parliament. There's a big spectrum there that we could explore more. They cared most about habitat destruction. Bird of prey persecution was very motivating. Illegal hunting and hunting of migratory species was another big motivator, and pesticides. People were very conscious of pesticide use and being very anti this. 16% in total weren't aware that optics companies made equipment for hunting overall. So quite a small proportion of people. When we start to break down the audiences, it's where it gets really interesting. So let's take a look at gender. We had 310 females versus over 1,000 male respondents. Females were more likely to take part in wildlife friendly habits and were less likely to describe themselves as specialists or experts. One part of me is very shocked by this, and the slightly cynical side of me is not surprised by this, by my own experiences. There's a lot of data out there that shows that females are more likely to suffer from imposter syndrome or hold back. So they're probably grading themselves slightly more harshly than the males within the industry who are pushing themselves forward as specialists and experts. Females were more likely to watch wildlife in their gardens, significantly so. And all genders were preferring to watch wildlife alone, but females were more likely to go with a partner. If you haven't seen my article in Birdwatch that was published online about 2 or 3 months ago now, called Call It Out, I do recommend you have a look at that, about some of the issues that women face when they go out into rural areas to go bird watching and looking at nature, and look at some of those barriers they face, because that kind of explains why women are more likely to go bird watching with a partner or with a friend. Females were less aware that optics companies made equipment for and marketed to hunted audience. So 32% of them said this, which was significantly a significantly bigger group of people saying that they were not aware of this. All genders favoured the quality of the optics as the most important feature. However, females were far more conscious of cost and weight compared to men who were more driven by brand. And again, as a female using optics, I would say that cost and weight are two of my main motivators. Weight especially. I get neck ache quite easily, and I struggle to carry a pair of binoculars and a telescope, and also look after my little girl. So there are different barriers there, which I'm sure you're all aware of, but something just to bear in mind with your marketing and the kind of products you're pushing forward. Women were much less likely to own a camera for wildlife photography, so 44% compared to 61% of men. Women tended to favour those lower cost brands as well. So Opticron took 29% of the female market, Viking took 27% of the female market, compared to men, where 38% of them wanted Swarovski. Women were much less likely to have been gifted optics as a young person, which I think is absolutely fascinating. When we look at those age groups, what are we saying? That parents didn't feel that optics were a suitable present. Maybe young girls didn't feel like they could ask for them, or maybe they just didn't want them. They faced different social pressures growing up. But they were much more likely to be gifted optics in adult life by a loved one. And by that, we can probably make an assumption that that is their partner, who is very likely to be interested in wildlife as well. So we're seeing different influences at different stages in lives, depending on gender and how people experience nature. When you're young, your biggest influences are first and foremost from your parents, your immediate family, and then from your friends. And as you get older, that shifts to being a family that you've created yourself. So your partner and any children that you may have. And women seem to be taking up natural history and buying their optics in that later part of life. Women were far more likely to consider ethics, with 20% of women versus 14% of men. And they, when they're choosing their optics in terms of looking at the company ratings, and also were more likely to shop ethically overall. And then we get into comparing age, which again, I find absolutely fascinating. For disclaimer, I am now 30, but for many years was seen as a young person, which was very exciting. I am now no longer seen as a young person, which is a bit depressing. But for this purposes, moving my things around. We've considered young people as below the age of 30, middle-aged from 31 to 60, and older people from 61 and over. You can see the spread of responses there. We got most responses in our middle-aged category, but a good mix overall, which I'm reasonably happy with. In terms of how they identified themselves, really interestingly, younger people were very quick to identify themselves as a specialist or an expert. The middle-age group were the least likely to do this, and older people sitting in the middle. So young people have either got very high aspirations of where they want to be, or they're specializing at a younger age. Camera ownership was much more prevalent in young people, with 70% of young people owning a camera for wildlife photography of some description. And the most popular brands for young people were Swarovski, Opticron, Canon, and then Nikon. You can see how this shifts into the older generations, with Leica and Zeiss coming into the frame as well, but usually for people who are over the age of 31. The most desirable features were quality across the board, with cost playing a big factor in young people and usability being quite a big thing as well. I'm assuming that's because they've never used binoculars and telescopes before, so they're getting used to that kit. When we look at middle-aged people, quality again, cost again, but the reputation of the brand comes into play when you reach middle age, and also the weight as well. And the same following through with older people who are again conscious of that brand reputation. When we look at the likelihood of shopping ethically, young people were by far the most likely group to shop ethically, with 59% of them saying that they would, compared to 34% of older people. And again, I don't think this is surprising, but it's still an interesting thing to consider in your marketing. Awareness that optics companies could be associated with hunting. 77% of young people were aware. The middle-age group were the most aware group with 85%, and that older group were in the middle with 83%. So I was expecting young people to be really in tune with this, given that this has been a discussion ongoing for the past 5 years, and it shows actually young people aren't fully aware of this yet, but they are very ethically aware overall. Across the board, habitat destruction was a real driving force for people, along with raptor persecution. Pesticides came in very highly with young people as well, but we see those illegal hunting messages being very big drivers for people. People are really not liking illegal hunting across the board, whether that's in the UK or whether that was further afield with things like migratory birds. And finally, when we look at the perceived expertise of people, for this, we were looking at the specialists and the experts. So 32% were under the age of 30, 39% were 46 to 60, and 29% were over 61. And 90% of these were in the UK. 77% identified as male, and they were all white British. And 50% of them had a local patch, but there was a far wider spread of where people watch wildlife through, from their garden through to internationally. So from that, we take away that the more you perceive yourself to be a specialist or the expert, the more likely you are to travel further afield in order to pursue your wildlife watching hobbies. Largely watching wildlife on their own, with 70% of them saying that that's their preferred place to watch wildlife, preferred way to watch wildlife, sorry. So half of this group are favouring Swarovski, with Leica and Zeiss being more popular than with the other groups that we've looked at so far. So this is where we see those other high-end brands, the brands that are a little bit more expensive, really coming to the forefront there with this group of people, the people who perceive themselves to be specialists or experts. And we can assume from that that association with cost also comes a higher quality product. Opticron and Canon, who performed well with other groups, were much less popular with this group. But Opticron was the most popular I used to own brand. When we looked at what people used to own and when they got them, Opticron was very often a first brand that they were bought as children, and then progressing on to the more expensive kit as they got older. Most of this group rarely upgrade their optics, so I think these guys are really taking hold of their optics, and they've got quite emotional attachments to them. I know a lot of birders that I personally interact with have had their optics for 10, 20 years even, because they get used to that product and they really like that brand. I also know a lot of people who've talked about upgrading and then basically freak out because they can't bear the thought of having to go through it all again. Quality is easily the most cited reason for the choice, with over 90% of this group saying quality was their main motivator, followed by cost, but again, much lower with only 43%, brand at 42%, and weight at 37%. Reviews were incredibly important, followed by reputation of the brand and word of mouth from friends, followed by demonstrations. So demos still kind of important, but not as much with this specialist expert group. The wildlife issues that this group cared about were habitat destruction, illegal bird of prey persecution, and hunting of migratory birds. I think there is an element of this where we can assume that media coverage of things like hen harrier persecution and illegal hunting in Malta has really contributed to people's driving factors, showing that the stories that make the headlines really can influence the way that people approach wildlife and really decide what issues they care about. Trophy hunting, for example, came in at just 25%, well behind illegal hunting at 40%. And like I said at the beginning, we kept these intentionally vague. It would be really interesting to go deeper into these issues, perhaps with some qualitative interviews with people to establish why they're motivated by these things and what differences they perceive between different kinds of hunting, for example. Overall, this group are slightly less interested in taking action for wildlife, which is very interesting that the higher level you perceive yourself, the less interested you are in actually helping wildlife. So recycling was very popular at 90% and wildlife gardening at 74%, but others tended to be lower than average, in some cases much lower. For example, ethical shopping was practiced by just 32% of them compared to over 40% from the other general sample size. Only 6% weren't aware that optics companies manufactured equipment used for hunting. So this is a group that is very educated in these issues and has made their choices accordingly based on their values. Overall, they are aware of it, but obviously it is not a driving factor for them. So to wrap up, what can we do with this? And this is where we're basically offering this information to you. We want you to use it. There might be stuff in here that's really useful for you. I know I've done a couple of marketing calls with people recently, and I've thought, you know what, this information is good for you. This will help you. So use the data that we've got there, and please do get in contact with me if you'd like to arrange a more in-depth call to go through any of the information. If you have been labelled as ethical by Ethical Consumer, and I'm aware that that's quite a controversial area for some of you, but I would say embrace that. There's 3 companies who were labelled as incredibly ethical and got a clean slate. So that was Opticron, Olympus and Canon in terms of their attitude towards hunting and welfare. There were other companies as well who maybe just a few tweaks around the edges would get them that full ethical rating. They were seen as only having weak links to the hunting industry. So if you have been labelled as ethical, I think there's a real marketing opportunity for you to actually take that on board. I would say be transparent in your marketing. The reason that these conversations have even started to happen in the past 10 years is because that transparency did not exist. We've all heard the famous story about Bill Oddie at Bird Fair and starting to shout because he didn't know that the companies were doing this and didn't know that companies manufactured hunting gear. That conversation is far more out there in the public domain right now. So I would say be really transparent in your marketing. There's nothing worse than companies trying to hide different bits of information behind different social media channels. Ultimately, people do have the right to make consumer decisions, and that they should be well informed when they do that. Use your channels and ambassadors for education. Pretty much every optics company I know uses ambassadors in some way and has very active digital channels, to say the least. When you're recruiting ambassadors, I would say be really transparent with them as well. Make sure that they're aware of the Ethical Consumer reports, because it may be that whilst they support your brand in theory, because of work ties, because of their employment status, or because of personal ethics, they don't feel that that is actually an association that they want to have. And I think that's a really fair thing to say to them, especially when you're talking to young people, and especially when they are under the age of 18. There is a whole world of marketing to children that is very dangerous. And I think the way you recruit your ambassadors and the way that you train your ambassadors should include this information so that they can make the right decision for them and not be blindsided at a later date when someone points it out to them in a way that creates conflict or drama on social media or questions their own integrity. And use those people as well. If they're well informed, they will be able to represent your brand the best that they can and answer questions about that. And I know I've had those awkward conversations with a few brand ambassadors in the past year since I've been doing this piece of work, who genuinely were not aware of the other sides of the businesses. It wouldn't necessarily change their sponsorship, but not being aware of it was very disconcerting for them, and that attitude doesn't build trust. If you've got really well informed ambassadors and really transparent channels, then you can use those for education purposes. And education in this context is everything. It may be that your company only supports ethical shooting or that kind of thing. And in that respect, there are nuances within these discussions that shouldn't necessarily be boiled down to black and white. Don't jump on marketing bandwagons and conflict with your values. And I think this is really important. I've seen a few optics companies recently jumping on board the nature and well-being bandwagon, which has been going on for about the past 5 years now. I think if you are a company that is actively supporting hunting and promoting things like trophy hunting on your channels, this is not necessarily the angle you want to go down, because it's going to be taking up staff time ultimately. When people realize this and start having a go at you on social media, there are other more forward-thinking ways of and more sophisticated ways of using your marketing than just jumping on board the go outside to look at wildlife because it's good for you angle. The next one is don't shy away from or close down these discussions. I'm really glad that so many of you are here, and I'm aware that some of the companies listening to this weren't rated ethical by Ethical Consumer. The most important thing for me in this is having the transparency to be able to have these discussions, recognizing that some people really do care about the ethics of the company and that they have the right to make that decision. It shouldn't be about blindsiding them or covering up parts of your business in order just to get that sale, but rather being part of the discussion and using the voice and the influence you have for good. For example, I'm jumping to my last point here. For example, promoting sustainable kinds of hunting, condemning things when they're bad. We all know that illegal hunting is bad, but is there a role that your company can play in not supporting hunters who take forward those ideals and who are doing things wrong? Is there a way you can work within the hunting and shooting community to make it better from within? So I would say don't shy away from these discussions or try and close them down. Please don't pull your funding, for example, from magazines if they want to discuss this. Don't pull your advertising from online sources. Don't pull your advertising from annual reports, etc., if they take a different stance to you. Because in the 21st century, when we look at the spread of information, transparency is everything. And these open discussions build trust and confidence in brands, no matter where they stand on an issue. I would recommend including ethical ratings in reviews. This is one more for the magazines, etc. Again, being really transparent and giving people all of the information, not just this is a great piece of kit, but this is the company that it comes from. And I think those are really important areas to promote rather than it just being about the product, but also looking at the brand behind the product. Don't use greenwash. I know that some companies are doing amazing things going forward with like recyclable packaging, etc. But one big area of the Ethical Consumer Report looked at sustainability. So please don't over-egg your sustainability factors if you know that there are things that you could do better within your business. Let's look to change those within your business. And as I've already touched on, use your power for good. I know we've got some really big companies here who are very influential in the wildlife watching world. And I think as we move forward, when we look at conservation conflicts and conservation issues, wouldn't it be great if we could all be having more discussions in a really safe space? I mean, I'm aware as a birder and someone with a big Twitter following, the moment I put my head above the parapet to talk about this, I get jumped on. I feel we should be fostering safer spaces for people to share their thoughts and opinions and make decisions based on their own ethics. Ethics are innately personal to people. Hopefully this presentation has showed you that you can safely have these discussions. You're not going to lose vast sections of your market. You may lose some, but you may find opportunities elsewhere. And ultimately, we want to take this forward for the good of conservation and for the good of the natural world. So what are the opportunities for your company, and how can you help be part of a discussion rather than shying away from it? Thank you very much. Fantastic, dead on 40 minutes, which is what I hoped. Like I said, I'm very happy to have chats with anyone from the optical companies offline. I'd rather not take questions now because I'm doing everything at once. But please do contact me on my email address, lucy.mcrobbert@hotmail.co.uk, to set up a time. I am off work next week if you don't hear back from me straight away, but I will get in contact with you as soon as possible. This talk has been recorded, so will be shared more widely, either at the end of the day today or in a week's time. Thank you very much for giving up your Friday lunch times, and I look forward to hearing from some of you and continuing to work in this area in the future.